What is the first thing you think of when Five Nights at Freddy's is mentioned? Is it the animatronics, the lore, the movies and books surrounding it? Chances are, though, you're not thinking about how scary FNAF is. And that's a little weird, right? You see, this franchise began as one of the most uniquely terrifying horror experiences in gaming. It was minimalist, claustrophobic, and kinda unforgettable. But the fear that once defined it has become secondary, now replaced by a lot of memes, theories, and merchandise that tends to be aimed at younger audiences. The lack of emphasis on horror that has been present within the franchise lately has been strange, especially considering that horror is the very foundation it was built upon. Nowadays, it's harder to argue that Five Nights at Freddy's is truly scary. Sure, it still has jump scares and an eerie ambience, but those are often drowned out by the sheer weight of the franchise's cultural saturation. It's a media empire now. It has books, movies, toys, plushies, and an endless stream of lore videos that have all expanded the brand far beyond its original indie roots. For this video, I want to just focus on the core of FNAF, the main games. I haven't read the books, and there's currently only one movie out, so I'll be mostly setting those aside. What I'd like to explore is if FNAF, as a game series, is still functioning as horror. Is it still capable of scaring us, or has it become something else entirely? To start with, let's talk about the rise of Five Nights at Freddy's. What made it scary in the first place, and how those elements intersect with the psychology of horror. In 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's released as a small indie game made by Scott Horror. He had made previous games before this, but was told his characters were too uncanny and scary for the genre. So he decided to capitalize on it as a last-ditch effort. After being picked up by some small YouTubers, it quickly rose to internet stardom. But this wasn't just another viral indie title. Five Nights at Freddy's actually stuck around. It didn't just trend, it embedded itself in internet culture, carving out its own little pocket on the web. YouTubers loved it because it made for incredibly watchable content, with sharp spikes of tension, ridiculous reactions, and a mysterious backstory that encouraged endless speculation. Audiences loved it because it was weird, creepy, and oddly compelling in a way that few horror games at the time managed to be. It turns out that those uncanny characters worked phenomenally in a horror setting. Their awkward and robotic movements and frozen expressions tapping into some deep-seated fear of the inhuman, what we might call the uncanny valley effect. And the gentle hints of a deeper story within the game were just enough to inspire curiosity. They were never too clear, but they piqued people's imaginations. Theories spread like wildfire across forums and YouTube comment sections, spawning timelines, fanfics, and conspiracies that somehow roped in murder, missing children, and immortal purple men. But the biggest thing that FNAF used, and a huge part of why people loved watching gameplay videos of it, were its jump scares. They were the franchise's signature. They were predictable yet effective, cartoonish but startling. They struck that perfect balance between fear and fun. And in an age where reaction content was just beginning to explode, FNAF's jump scares became a kind of rite of passage for creators and viewers alike. Jump scares are most effective when there's a combination of a sudden and unexpected visual and audible stimulus. Five Nights at Freddy's tends to excel in this due to the core aspects of its gameplay. First, you are completely locked down. There's nowhere to run, and the only way you can move is by looking around. This restriction in mobility mirrors real-world panic responses, where the inability to escape can intensify feelings of fear and helplessness. Second, the game itself requires a form of hypervigilance, especially as you get into harder and harder nights. You are constantly watching, anticipating, and calculating, but never quite knowing. This effectively primes you, the player, to be jump scared by creating a sustained sense of tension and apprehension. It's much harder to evoke the startle response while in a relaxed state, but it can become much easier and much stronger when someone is already feeling tense or anxious. In other words, Five Nights at Freddy's manufactures an environment of stress and pressure, then times its scares to land when you're least able to brush them off, in order to elicit as strong of a reaction as possible. The tension and jump scares lend themselves quite nicely to Five Nights at Freddy's other core gameplay mechanic, that being power management. It would be too easy if you could constantly shut out animatronics with no penalty, which is why you need to make sure you don't run out of batteries. The dwindling battery becomes a countdown not only to failure, but to fear. It transforms the act of self-protection into a calculated risk, and that risk is always hanging over you. The tension grows at this point because your main line of defense has a glaring weakness, and the most effective way to play is to wait until the last possible moment to shut doors, flash the lights, etc. Every time someone or something gets close to you, you have to hold your breath while playing with fire. That hesitation of knowing that reacting too early could mean death by power outage, and too late means death by jump scare, creates a storm of dread, anticipation, and helplessness. Video games themselves are uniquely suited to the horror genre too. Unlike cinema, which puts the viewer as a passive observer, games force the player into a more active role. By being in this active role, you're not only watching the events unfold, you yourself are made responsible for what happens next. There's a lot that could be unpacked here, and it's a topic that stretches well beyond the bounds of this video. But to summarize, the emotional mechanics of horror games are fundamentally different from those of cinema. In a fear, the fear remains primarily external. You're empathizing with the characters on a screen, but you don't feel like it's directly happening to you. But on the flip side, in a video game, the fear becomes more internal. You're not just watching someone hide from an animatronic, you yourself are the one hiding. This engagement leads to a phenomenon known as avatar identification. When a game is designed well, it becomes easy for players to identify with their in-game avatar. You begin to internalize everything that is happening to them. And in the heat of the moment, your brain doesn't always distinguish between this is happening to my character and this is happening to me. This results in an extremely powerful form of fear. If you want to learn more about avatar identification and how games can trick us into feeling real emotions, I actually made a video that covers this topic somewhat, so feel free to check it out after this one. In the years following its surprise success in 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's evolved from a simple but contained indie horror experience into a large multimedia franchise. Each sequel attempted to raise the stakes not just in difficulty or complexity, but in narrative depth and design. With every new installment, Scott Cawthon layered more onto the story. New mechanics, new characters, new timelines, and increasingly cryptic lore. Each sequel in the FNAF series attempted to build upon the last, but not always in terms of fear. The earliest games, like Five Nights at Freddy's 1 through 3, were tightly contained in scope. A few rooms, simple mechanics, and an atmosphere of suffocating dread. In fact, FNAF 3 was originally designed to be the final game, but after people complained about it not being scary enough, Scott decided to go overboard with FNAF 4, and that's how we got the Nightmare animatronics. After FNAF 4 though, the series began to progress. The games became more elaborate, like in Sister Location, there was an introduction of a more overt narrative structure. You had more narration from the actual animatronics, like Baby, and there would even be little scenes at the end of Nights. And then, by the end of the game, you actually got a small cutscene of your own death. And then you had Pizzeria Simulator, which completely broke away from the style of game that was previously known. You began running your own pizza shop, and while you did engage with scary animatronics sometimes, it was not really something you had to do. It was actually completely optional and was only there in order to get the true ending of the game. It was great for fans of the franchise, don't get me wrong, but for someone just casually playing through the games, they might not actually get to experience the real horror of Pizzeria Simulator. And then Security Breach, again, broke away from the mold by having it be first person and open world. You were actually moving around an environment. In these games, the series sacrificed a bit of what made it frightening in the first place. The claustrophobia, the helplessness, the cold tension of waiting. The complexity of the games grew, but the horror began to diminish. One of the biggest shifts in the Five Nights at Freddy's experience has been its transition from evoking fear to evoking curiosity. Horror loves using the unknown, the fear of what we cannot understand or what we don't know. It drives a lot of the fear that we tend to experience in horror games and horror movies. Ironically though, as the FNAF lore became more expansive and more detailed, it slowly became more explainable. The animatronics ceased to be uncanny threats lurking in the dark and instead became known entities with tragic backstories and even psychological depth. They became characters that we understood rather than monsters that we feared. A transformation was underway, steadily moving from the games being about avoiding these monstrous metal mechanisms to feeling sympathy or even pity on the very things that the horror had been centered around. At this point, while you were playing the games, you wouldn't feel as much fear for the animatronics because you kind of just felt bad for them. You knew that inside of each of these things were the spirits of dead kids, if you had been paying attention to the lore, that is. At that point, if you had been paying attention to the lore, most of the horror aspects of the franchise would be centered around the fact that William Afton was a child murderer and serial killer. But you don't really get a lot of that within the games themselves because how buried the narrative is. And overall, this transformation was heavily fueled by the rise of online theory culture. Chief among its heralds was MatPat's Game Theory channel, which turned FNAF into a narrative treasure hunt. Each new game wasn't just a horror game, it was a riddle and puzzle. Players were no longer just trying to survive the night, they were also decoding clues and piecing together timelines. The fear that was once present began to shift even more to a place of curiosity, to the point where even the narrative moments were beginning to lose any emotional impact due to the narrative complexity. Anytime new information was revealed, people's first thoughts would be, how is this related to the books, or does this validate or invalidate that one theory, instead of actually engaging with the narrative then and there. There's nothing inherently wrong with this shift, it's a sign that the franchise captured the imaginations and invited deeper engagement. But the emotional register is entirely different. It's not terror, it's intrigue now, and that tonal shift fundamentally alters how people connect with and even play the games. Then, as FNAF gained cultural traction, it didn't take long for the merchandising to be pushed. Plushies, action figures, Funko Pops, Halloween costumes. FNAF exploded into physical form. What began as something grotesque and niche quickly became something you could find in any Walmart toy aisle. The designs were simplified, the edges rounded off, the horror stylized into a slightly more child-friendly aesthetic. And with that accessibility came a younger fan base. The early FNAF community consisted mostly of teens and young adults, people that were drawn to its horror and internet mystery, but the newer wave of fans began to start skewing younger. Anecdotally, many elementary-age children now cite FNAF as a favorite franchise. It's not just tolerated by kids, it's marketed to them. There's even pillow pets. I was being very serious about the toy aisle part. I could literally go to Walmart right now and find FNAF action figures next to Pokemon cards. The morality of a horror franchise about literal child murder being marketed to children aside, this does have a fundamental impact on how people outside of FNAF's niche will view the games. Fundamentally, they appear to be more childish, and with that, even less scary. The once terrifying animatronic mascots have become very literal IRL mascots of the franchise. So here we arrive at a bizarre impasse. Is FNAF still a horror franchise? Or has it become a brand that wears the costume of horror while primarily functioning as entertainment and nostalgia? Even if FNAF isn't scary in the traditional sense anymore, it does still carry weight. For many, FNAF is emotionally resonant. The dim lighting, the grainy office feed, the twitching of animatronic limbs, these are all nostalgic for many of us now. For younger players, FNAF might not have ever been about fear in the first place. It was always about characters and aesthetics and storytelling and lore. For the older fans, there's something a little melancholic about that though. The raw anxiety of hearing footsteps in the hall, the gut punch of a sudden jump scare, the obsessive scrolling through forums at 2 a.m. to decipher the latest lore drop, these moments may never be replicated. But they're remembered, and memory in its own way is powerful. Memory. Was FNAF ever scary? Many have already pointed out how jump scares are, at the very least, a cheap form of horror, if they can even be considered horror at all. Jump scares often bypass the deeper emotional and psychological engagement that true horror thrives on, opting instead for a reflexive jolt. Unfortunately for the layperson playing the FNAF games, these jump scares were the primary form of horror that they'd be exposed to. The narrative is hidden in newspaper clippings and cryptic minigames instead. You don't really get a good sense of the lore and underlying stories within the games just by playing them casually. From a story standpoint, though, this is absolutely fascinating. It gives the game layers, and it makes it feel like there's something beneath the surface just waiting to be uncovered. This has generated a plethora of discussion online, helping make an entire ecosystem of content creators. But from a pure gameplay perspective, it makes FNAF extremely lackluster in the horror department, with what it has going for it being a buildup of tension, followed by either the relief of reaching the end of the night or sudden fear by being jump-scared by an animatronic. The cycle then just repeats, with the horror becoming extremely predictable and formulaic. What hurts the games even more, though, is the natural human ability to habituate. Habituation is whenever a creature's response, either emotional or physiological, to repeated stimulus diminishes over time, due to the repetition of said stimulus. To put it simply, the more you are exposed to something, the less it will have an impact on you. Now, there is such a thing known as sensitization, where the opposite happens, but that's fairly less common to see. But habituation, it happens all the time. It's like getting used to a new pair of shoes, or a wild animal losing its fear of humans after many interactions, or, in our case, no longer being affected by jump scares. Think of it like this. The first time Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy lunges at you from the darkness, it's startling. It's a little scary. Your heart rate spikes, your body tenses, your brain releases the adrenaline and endorphins. But what happens the 10th time, the 20th time? By then, you've seen the animation, you've heard the sound, you know exactly what's coming. What we're left with then is just a routine. The jump scare becomes a minor inconvenience, and this reveals the biggest and most fundamental flaw of the over-reliance on jump scares. They just don't linger. They don't fester in your mind hours later the way psychological horror does. They don't evoke any subtle, crawling sense of unease. That doesn't mean that they're useless. When used sparingly, jump scares can enhance horror. They can act as the climax to build up tension. But when used too frequently, or worse, when they become the core of the horror, they wear extremely thin. The FNAF franchise, especially in its earlier entries, leaned heavily on them. What's most ironic is that FNAF clearly had the potential for deeper horror. Its narrative is steeped in grief, loss of children, guilt, and trauma. Its visual designs play into the uncanny valley theory and the weaponization of nostalgia. But the moment-to-moment experience for most players is just flash, scream, game over. And outside the game, so the franchise as a whole has begun to step away from traditional horror. I discussed earlier how FNAF has slowly begun to skew younger with its audience, creating the toys and merchandise that's appealing to them, making the franchise seem less scary. But I think we can see this spreading to other aspects of the franchise as well. The first movie was criticized for not being scary enough for a horror movie, and based on critic reception, it's pretty obvious that the movie was primarily meant to be a love letter to the fans of the series. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but it does seem pretty disingenuous for the horror game franchise to make a horror movie that wasn't even considered scary. It was a creepy aesthetic draped over a surprisingly sentimental and family-friendly core. That doesn't make it a bad movie, but it does reflect a clear shift in tone. For the record, I actually did really enjoy the FNAF movie, just saying. I feel like you can see the franchise's new direction, especially with Security Breach, the first FNAF game that wasn't made by Scott Cawthon. Steelwool has made many different artistic choices for the game, opting for a slightly more cartoony art style, and making the gameplay itself first-person open world. I'm not going to comment on the quality of the game in and of itself, but I will say that the animatronics have certainly lost some of the uncanny feeling. Except for those Weeping Angel Snapbot things. Those are actually kind of freaky to me, I'm going to be really honest with you. But the main animatronics use bright colors and patterns now. They are clearly made to be eye-catching, both inside of the FNAF universe and for the merchandise that they're selling. Security Breach has changed a lot about what we should expect from the franchise. The mystery is still there, the breadcrumbs of lore are still present, but now we have a bunch of dialogue and cutscenes and more defined character personalities. That in and of itself isn't a negative, as it can add depth and emotional range, but also means that the creepiness, the stillness, the unsettling ambiguity has started to decrease. It doesn't help that the game was so riddled with bugs when it first released, it was almost comical and not scary. It had T-posing animatronics, broken AI, and physics glitches. It still has a lot of these things to this day. It was like watching a haunted house fall apart in real time. FNAF is at a strange intersection right now. It's still about horror, but it no longer feels like horror. It's nostalgic, it's mysterious, it's even a little charming, but it doesn't crawl under your skin like the way it used to. Did it ever really used to? Has FNAF really ever been scary? Maybe when we were younger, and to the younger generations now, but as adults, can we look at the old games and honestly say they were scary? The most it had going for it was hidden lore, uncanny animatronics, and jump scares. That doesn't scream horror, it's more of a horror aesthetic. Plus, I've heard great things about how many of the books are definitely scary, and the VR games are so immersive it can be hard not to be scared while playing them. Maybe FNAF doesn't need to always be scary. Personally, I've never found the franchise itself to be scary, but I've still loved it over the years. I still enjoy keeping up with the lore and learning where the story is going next. I'll probably even see the next movie when it releases. A lack of real horror doesn't really detract from what the franchise has set out to do over the years. It still has the complex and engaging narrative that people love trying to pick apart. And it's somewhat unfortunate that the franchise still hasn't embraced its own horror to its full potential. But the fact that it's been this successful and it hasn't gone full throttle with its horror is kind of impressive. At the very least, it shows that there's still more that can be done, more narratives and ideas to explore, more fear to create for players, readers, and viewers. At this point, I kind of think of FNAF like the reverse of Doki Doki Literature Club, where it's a series that lures you in with a horror aesthetic and jump scares, but continues to engage you with deeper mysteries, puzzles to solve, and characters to love. It's a little cheesy, I'll admit, but you can't deny that it's worked. FNAF has been so successful, it's created its own subgenre called Mascot Horror. It's not very often that some random indie game can make a claim like that. So, yeah, FNAF probably isn't all that scary anymore, and it probably was never that scary to begin with. But it has its moments, and more importantly, it has a dedicated and growing fan base, and it's beloved by millions. We can criticize it all we want, but the fact that we can criticize it so heavily is a testament to what this franchise has accomplished. Although now I'm really starting to wonder about the ethics of marketing horror game merchandise to children. I guess I'll have to save that topic for another day. And until next time, this is Cognizant Pixels, signing off.